The gavel sits on my desk like an accusation. 28 years I've wielded it in the name of justice, 28 years of decisions that have shaped lives, destroyed families, and supposedly served the greater good. But there's one case, one terrible, unforgivable decision that haunts every ruling I've made since. The sound of that gavel falling 13 years ago still echoes in my chambers, marking the moment I chose personal vendetta over a child's safety. Her name was Emma Caldwell, 7 years old, with brown pigtails and a gap-toothed smile that should have been my only consideration when I awarded custody to her father. Instead, I let my hatred for her mother's attorney cloud my judgment, and now Emma is dead because of it. I am the Honorable Judge Margaret Holloway, and I am responsible for the murder of a child. The irony isn't lost on me that I've spent my entire career advocating for children's rights. Before ascending to the bench, I worked as a family law attorney specializing in child welfare cases. I built my reputation on protecting the vulnerable, ensuring that the best interests of children always came first. The governor appointed me to the family court specifically because of my track record in child advocacy. But advocates can fall as far as anyone else when pride and personal animosity corrupt their judgment. The Caldwell custody case came before me in November of 2011. Rebecca Caldwell was seeking to relocate to Portland with her daughter Emma, citing concerns about her ex-husband, David's increasingly volatile behavior. David was contesting the move and demanding full custody, claiming that Rebecca was an unfit mother attempting to alienate him from his child. On paper, it seemed like a standard post-divorce dispute. Divorced parents fighting over custody arrangements, each side painting the other as unfit, both claiming to act in their child's best interests. I'd seen hundreds of cases like it, navigated the murky waters of he said, she said accusations, while trying to discern the truth beneath layers of post-divorce acrimony. But this case was different because of Rebecca's attorney, Marcus Brennan. Marcus and I had a history that went back 15 years to when we were both ambitious young lawyers working in the district attorney's office. We'd been colleagues, then friends, then lovers in a relationship that lasted 2 intense years before imploding spectacularly. The end came when I discovered Marcus had been feeding information about my cases to defense attorneys in exchange for favorable plea bargains that made his conviction rate look impressive. I'd reported him to the state bar, testified at his disciplinary hearing, and watched as his career crumbled under the weight of his ethical violations. He'd been suspended for 2 years, lost his position at the DA's office, and struggled to rebuild his practice afterward. The ambitious prosecutor who'd once been talked about as a future judge ended up scraping by with divorce and personal injury cases. Marcus blamed me for destroying his career. I blamed him for betraying everything we'd both sworn to uphold. The hatred between us had festered for over a decade by the time Rebecca Caldwell walked into his office seeking representation. I should have recused myself the moment I saw Marcus's name on the filing. Judicial ethics require stepping aside when personal relationships might compromise impartiality. But I told myself I could be objective, that my professional integrity would override personal feelings. The truth was darker. I wanted the chance to rule against Marcus, to show him that his unethical behavior had consequences that extended far beyond his own career. The custody hearing lasted 3 days. Rebecca Caldwell took the stand and testified about David's drinking, his explosive temper, incidents where he'd frightened Emma with his rage. She presented photos of bruises she claimed he'd given her during their marriage, restraining order applications that had been filed but withdrawn, police reports from domestic disturbance calls that never resulted in charges. David's attorney, James Morrison, painted Rebecca as a vindictive ex-wife trying to weaponize custody to punish her former husband. He argued that her allegations were fabricated, timing designed to coincide with her desire to relocate for a new job opportunity. David, he claimed, was a devoted father whose only crime was fighting for his right to remain in his daughter's life. I watched it all unfold with the detached professionalism I'd cultivated over years on the bench, but underneath I was focused on Marcus. The way he presented his arguments, the witnesses he called, the evidence he submitted. I found myself scrutinizing everything for signs of the same corner cutting and ethical flexibility that had destroyed his prosecutorial career. The moment that sealed Emma's fate came on the second day of testimony. Rebecca was describing an incident where David had grabbed her arm during an argument in front of Emma, leaving fingerprint bruises that she'd photographed. It was compelling evidence of domestic violence, exactly the kind of testimony that should have raised serious concerns about David's fitness as a custodial parent. But Marcus made a tactical error. In his eagerness to emphasize the incident's impact on Emma, he asked a leading question that technically violated evidence rules. David's attorney objected, and I sustained it. Not because the objection was particularly strong, but because I wanted to see Marcus squirm. "Your Honor," Marcus said, his voice tight with frustration, "this testimony is crucial to establishing a pattern of violence in front of the child." "Counsel should know better than to lead his witness," I replied coldly. "Perhaps if you'd prepared your case more thoroughly, you wouldn't need to put words in your client's mouth." It was a petty shot, completely inappropriate for a judge to take. Marcus's face flushed with anger, and I felt a surge of satisfaction at having humiliated him in open court. But my vindictive moment had cost Rebecca crucial testimony about David's violence. The pattern continued throughout the hearing. I sustained objections against Marcus that I might have overruled for other attorneys. I allowed David's lawyer more latitude in cross-examination than I gave Rebecca's side. I nitpicked Marcus's procedural motions and cut short his arguments while giving David's attorney extended time to present his case. It wasn't dramatic enough for anyone to notice. Judicial bias rarely is. It came in small moments, subtle differences in tone and treatment that slowly tilted the scales of justice away from Rebecca and Emma. By the end of the 3-day hearing, Marcus looked defeated, and I felt the cold satisfaction of professional revenge. The evidence, fairly considered, should have supported Rebecca's concerns about David's fitness as a custodial parent. There were too many incidents, too many red flags, too much documented history of volatile behavior around Emma. A reasonable judge would have either awarded custody to Rebecca or, at minimum, required supervised visitation for David until he completed anger management and substance abuse counseling. But I wasn't being reasonable, I was being vindictive. I spent a week crafting my decision, carefully constructing legal reasoning that would justify awarding primary custody to David while making it seem like an objective application of family court standards. I wrote about the importance of father-child relationships, the presumption against relocating children away from established support systems, and Rebecca's failure to adequately substantiate her allegations of domestic violence. The decision was legally defensible, but morally bankrupt. I knew David was dangerous. I knew Emma would be at risk in his care. But my need to defeat Marcus Brennan trumped my responsibility to protect a 7-year-old girl. The gavel fell on December 15, 2011. This court awards primary physical custody to the father, David Caldwell, with supervised visitation rights to the mother, pending her establishment of suitable housing arrangements in this jurisdiction. Rebecca broke down crying in the gallery. Emma, who'd been waiting outside the courtroom, ran to her mother when she heard the verdict. I watched through my chamber's window as Marcus tried to comfort his client while a 7-year-old girl asked why she couldn't live with mommy anymore. David took custody that same day. He was smiling when he left the courthouse. Emma's small hand clutched in his much larger one. She looked back at her mother with confusion and fear that should have broken my heart. Instead, I felt only the hollow satisfaction of having beaten Marcus in court. The first incident happened within a month. Emma was hospitalized with a broken wrist that David claimed was from a playground accident. The ER doctor noted that the fracture pattern was consistent with a twist injury, someone grabbing a child's arm and wrenching it hard enough to snap the bone. But David stuck to his story. Emma was too frightened to contradict him, and Child Protective Services accepted his explanation after a cursory investigation. Rebecca filed an emergency motion to modify custody, represented now by a different attorney since Marcus had withdrawn from the case after our contempt of court exchange over his unprofessional conduct during the original hearing. The new lawyer was competent but unfamiliar with the case history, lacking the detailed knowledge Marcus had accumulated about David's pattern of violence. I denied the emergency motion. Broken bones, I ruled, were unfortunate but not uncommon in childhood accidents. Absent clear evidence of abuse, the court would not disrupt a custody arrangement based on speculation and post-divorce acrimony. The second incident was 3 months later. Emma arrived at school with finger-shaped bruises on her upper arms. Her teacher reported the marks to Child Protective Services, but by the time a caseworker interviewed Emma, the bruises had faded and the little girl claimed she didn't remember how she'd gotten them. David had coached her well, or terrified her into silence. Rebecca's new attorney filed another motion, this time including the teacher's photographs and statement. I reviewed the evidence with growing unease, seeing the clear progression of abuse that any objective observer would recognize. But I was trapped by my previous rulings and my unwillingness to admit that my decision had been wrong. I ordered a home study and psychological evaluation for both parents, a reasonable-sounding compromise that would delay any custody changes for months while David continued to have unsupervised access to Emma. The evaluations, when completed, were inconclusive. David presented well to professionals, coming across as a concerned father dealing with his ex-wife's vindictive accusations. Emma was too traumatized and confused to give coherent statements about her home life. The pattern of accidents continued. A split lip from falling off her bike, a black eye from walking into a door, carpet burns on her knees from playing too rough. Each incident was plausible in isolation, but together they painted a clear picture of systematic abuse. I knew what was happening. Every report that crossed my desk, every emergency room visit, every teacher's concern confirmed what I'd known from the beginning. David Caldwell was hurting his daughter, but acknowledging that truth would mean admitting that my custody decision had been based on personal vendetta rather than legal judgment. So I continued to deny Rebecca's motions, continued to find reasons why the evidence wasn't sufficient to warrant custody modification, continued to prioritize my professional reputation over Emma's safety. The end came on a Tuesday in March, 14 months after I'd awarded custody to David. Emma didn't show up for school that day. When the truancy officer went to check on her, David claimed she was sick with the flu. The school required a doctor's note for extended absences, but David said he was treating her at home with over-the-counter medication. Rebecca tried calling to check on Emma, but David wouldn't answer his phone. She drove to his apartment, but he wouldn't let her in, speaking to her through the locked door and claiming Emma was sleeping. Something in his voice, a manic edge that Rebecca recognized from their worst fights during marriage, made her call the police. The officers who responded found David barricaded in his apartment, incoherent with rage and alcohol. Emma was unconscious on the bathroom floor, her 7-year-old body bearing the evidence of months of escalating abuse that had finally crossed the line from torture to murder. The coroner determined that Emma had died from blunt force trauma to the head, consistent with being thrown against the bathroom wall with enough force to fracture her skull. The injuries that killed her were fresh, but the autopsy revealed dozens of older injuries in various stages of healing: broken ribs, internal bruising, cigarette burns on her arms and back. Emma Caldwell had been systematically tortured by her father for 14 months, while I refused to listen to her mother's desperate pleas for help. David was arrested and eventually convicted of second-degree murder. He's serving a life sentence, though that feels like cold comfort when measured against a 7-year-old's life. Rebecca moved away after the trial, unable to continue living in a town where every street corner held memories of the daughter she'd failed to protect. Marcus Brennan left the practice of law entirely after Emma's death. He sent me a letter shortly before moving out of state, 3 pages of handwritten grief and accusation that I've read so many times the paper is soft with handling. You knew, he wrote. From the first day of testimony, you knew David was dangerous, and you awarded him custody anyway. Not because you thought it was best for Emma, but because you wanted to punish me. A 7-year-old girl is dead because you cared more about settling old scores than protecting a child. He was right, of course. Every word of his letter was true, though I've never admitted that to anyone else. How do you confess that you murdered a child through judicial negligence motivated by personal hatred? How do you explain to the world that a family court judge, someone specifically entrusted with protecting children, chose revenge over a little girl's life? I've continued serving on the bench for 13 years since Emma's death, handling hundreds of custody cases with scrupulous attention to child welfare. My colleagues consider me one of the most thorough and child-focused judges in the state. I've written decisions that have become precedents for protecting children from abusive parents, spoken at conferences about the importance of believing children's voices in custody disputes. But every gavel I've struck since March 2012 has been an attempt to balance scales that can never be evened. Every child I've protected is measured against the one I failed to save. Every custody decision I make carries the weight of Emma's death, the knowledge that judicial power wielded carelessly can destroy innocent lives. The nightmare started within days of Emma's death. I see her in my dreams, not as she was in those final months, broken and terrified, but as she appeared in court that first day, brown pigtails, gap-toothed smile, holding her mother's hand, and trusting that the adults in her life would keep her safe. In the dreams, she asks me why I let Daddy hurt her, why I didn't listen when Mommy tried to tell everyone what was happening, why a judge, someone who was supposed to protect children, chose to punish her instead. I never have an answer for Dream Emma's questions. How do you explain to a 7-year-old that her death was collateral damage in an adult's quest for professional revenge? The weight of Emma's death has isolated me from everyone who might have offered comfort or absolution. I can't confess the truth to my judicial colleagues without destroying my career and facing potential criminal charges for judicial misconduct. I can't tell my family without shattering their image of me as a principled advocate for justice. I can't seek therapy without risking professional exposure. So I carry Emma's death alone, a secret that has poisoned every relationship in my life. My husband divorced me 5 years ago, claiming I'd become cold and distant. My adult children visit dutifully but warily, sensing the hollowness where their mother's warmth used to be. My grandchildren are polite but cautious around me, picking up on the sadness that radiates from me like heat from a fever. Last month, I received a letter from Emma Caldwell, the first contact I'd had with her since Emma's funeral. She's remarried now, living in Seattle, working as a victim's advocate for a domestic violence nonprofit. She wrote to tell me about the foundation she's established in Emma's memory, providing legal assistance to mothers trying to protect their children from abusive ex-husbands. Emma's death taught me that the system meant to protect children can fail them catastrophically, she wrote. But maybe we can honor her memory by helping other mothers navigate that system more successfully. The letter included a photograph of Emma taken just days before the custody hearing, a school picture showing a happy 7-year-old with bright eyes and an infectious smile. On the back, Rebecca had written, "She trusted us to keep her safe." I keep that photograph on my desk now, next to the gavel that ended Emma's life. Every custody case I hear, every decision I make about a child's welfare, I look at Emma's face and remember what happens when judges forget that children's lives matter more than adult grudges. But photographs and careful future decisions can't resurrect a 7-year-old girl or repair the fundamental corruption of a justice system that allowed personal hatred to trump child protection. Emma is still dead. I'm still the judge who killed her through willful negligence. And somewhere in Seattle, her mother still wakes up every morning knowing that her daughter might be alive if she'd had a different lawyer or a different judge. The truth about Emma's death will die with me. I'm too much of a coward to confess publicly, too selfish to destroy my remaining reputation by admitting what I did. Instead, I'll continue serving on the bench, protecting other people's children while carrying the weight of the one I failed to save. Justice is supposed to be blind, but in Emma's case, it was something worse. It was vindictive. And 13 years later, I'm still trying to wash the blood from my hands with decisions that come too late to matter to the little girl whose pigtails I can't forget. The gavel sits on my desk like an accusation, waiting for the next case, the next decision, the next chance to either protect a child or fail them. I pick it up carefully now, feeling its weight differently than I did before Emma died. It's not just a tool of judicial authority. It's a weapon that can destroy innocent lives when wielded by hands that prioritize adult grudges over children's safety. Emma Caldwell deserved better than the judge she got. Every child who comes before my court deserves better than a jurist carrying the guilt of previous failures. But this is what our system has. An imperfect woman in judicial robes, trying to balance scales that were broken by her own hands 13 years ago. The next case is being called. Another custody dispute, another child's future hanging in the balance. I look at Emma's photograph one more time, then lift the gavel that killed her, praying that this time, I'll find the wisdom and courage that failed me when it mattered most. Behind closed doors, justice sometimes wears the face of a 7-year-old girl whose trust was betrayed by the very system meant to protect her. And sometimes justice is nothing more than a guilty judge trying to spend the rest of her career making amends for the one decision that can never be undone.